Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking at the future of interplanetary settlement. But we're going to step right past those glossy sci-fi renders you always see and dive straight into the balance sheets. Because, somewhere on Mars, in the not-too-distant future, someone is going to take a breath of air that they didn't get for free. That air will be mined, split, and pumped through machinery that costs more than a literal hospital wing. The stark reality is that a Mars colony is, fundamentally, a payment plan. And air, that's the entry fee. So what actually happens when the money runs out on Mars? It's kind of a chilling question, right? We usually think of colonizing Mars as this monumental engineering challenge. But as we dig into the numbers today, I want you to view it through a totally different lens. What we're really looking at isn't just an engineering hurdle, it's the mathematical inevitability of a financial structure that, well, looks suspiciously like a pyramid scheme.
To really understand the problem, let's start with Section 1, the optimistic Mars pitch.
We hear about these genuine engineering triumphs all the time. Reusable rockets are absolutely crashing the cost of getting to space. We've got robots that can mine water ice. But we need to contrast the easy part, which is getting to Mars with cheaper rockets, against the brutal, hidden economic reality of being there. The engineering problem is just getting there. The economic problem is continuously paying to survive once you actually arrive.
Which brings us right into Section 2, the fixed cost trap.
The Martian environment is just incredibly unforgiving. The atmosphere is about 1% the pressure of Earth's. It's almost entirely carbon dioxide, and the average temperature sits at a freezing minus 60 degrees Celsius. So a Mars habitat isn't just a building. It's a continuous, non-optional industrial operation. Power generation, water recycling, radiation shielding, and pressurized seals, these are things that can never, ever fail.
NASA actually ran this brilliant experiment on the Perseverance rover called MOXIE. Over 2.5 years, it quietly proved that yes, we can pull oxygen straight out of the Martian atmosphere. The chemistry absolutely works. But over its entire mission, it produced a grand total of 122 grams of oxygen. To put that into perspective, that's roughly what a small dog breathes in about 10 hours. But here is the massive catch. It takes 25 metric tons of oxygen just to get 4 astronauts off the surface and back home for fuel alone. That is before a single colonist has even taken a breath to stay alive. The scale gap between experimental chemistry and actual colony survival is just absolutely massive. Now, unlike a research station in Antarctica or a submarine crew, which are subsidized indefinitely by a government back on Earth, a Mars colony won't have that luxury forever. Life support systems run whether they're keeping 10 people alive or 10,000. If your population shrinks, your fixed costs definitely don't. That means the cost per person just skyrockets. A shrinking colony is one where the cost of simply staying alive climbs every single day. So, if a colony can't feed itself or mine its own spare parts for decades, who's actually paying the massive ticket price for these early settlers? Let's look at history in Section 3, the interplanetary company town. Consider this staggering statistic. Between the 1630s and the American Revolution, roughly half to two-thirds of European immigrants crossed the Atlantic as indentured servants. They couldn't afford the passage, so they signed unpaid labor contracts for 4 to 7 years just to pay off the debt. When a ticket to Mars costs an absolute fortune, it is highly likely this exact debt structure will be repeated. You're going to finance your trip against your future earnings.
Think about the fundamental difference between an Earth town and a Mars colony. On Earth, in a 19th century coal or mill town, the company owned your house and the store. It was a monopoly on convenience, sure, but theoretically, you could always just walk to the next town. On Mars, there is no next town. Whoever owns the life support infrastructure holds a terrifying monopoly on existence itself. They are the only source of breathable air on the entire planet.
And this leads us to Section 4, the Ponzi scheme math.
A pyramid scheme doesn't actually need a villain in a boardroom. It just needs a specific structural feature. The returns promised to the early participants can only be paid by the money brought in by new participants. On Mars, early colonists are going to be promised that their labor and debt will eventually pay off as the colony grows. But machinery degrades. Replacement parts have to be shipped from Earth. The colony has to constantly fund this decaying infrastructure. So that growing financial burden has to be paid by one of 3 sources. Number 1, government subsidy, which is notoriously fragile politically. Number 2, private investment, which requires investors to firmly believe the colony will eventually turn a massive profit. Or number 3, new colonists, whose buy-ins pay off the previous promises. Survival depends entirely on an unbroken chain of these inflows.
If that chain breaks, let's say a launch window is missed or a bad recession hits Earth, the colony doesn't just go bankrupt on paper. It loses the ability to service obligations that are literally life and death. No new recruits equals no new oxygen. It is a pretty terrifying reality.
Let's move over to Section 5, the Fragile Launch Roadmap. Now, the engineering side is making incredible, undeniable progress. A dedicated SpaceX Starship launch is down to around $90 million. But SpaceX's own materials state that a self-sufficient Mars city needs upwards of 1 million people. I mean, that's the population of San Jose. True self-sufficiency, where you can actually manufacture your own microchips and replacement parts locally, is decades away at an absolute minimum.
When you map out the projected launch cadence, you're looking at 5 test flights in 2026, scaling all the way up to 500 by 2033. It is a complete hockey stick growth curve. The business plan mathematically demands an infinite accelerating influx of capital and bodies every single cycle just to keep the underlying math working.
But consider how fragile this plan gets when we track recent timeline shifts. In February 2026, Elon Musk announced Mars ambitions would be delayed 5 to 7 years to focus on lunar missions. By July, the timeline was back to 5 years. Now, we're looking at this impartially. Ambitious aerospace timelines slip all the time for perfectly good engineering reasons. But the crucial takeaway is that a financing plan dependent on a strict, exponential schedule breaks completely when that schedule slips.
But there are ways to fix it. Let's look at Section 6, how to break the cycle.
How did we dismantle company towns on Earth? We used regulations. Translated to Mars, that looks like this. Colonists actually having ownership stakes instead of just debt contracts. Earth-side regulatory bodies enforcing labor laws off-world. And structurally treating life support as a public utility rather than just a line item on a single company's balance sheet. These off-ramps are absolutely crucial to break the monopoly on air before it becomes permanent. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought, based on all the math we've just uncovered. In a system that requires constant, accelerating growth just to keep people breathing, which breaks first? The recruitment or the infrastructure? Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the boundaries of our future in space.